Against the backdrop of the large-scale battles of the Great Patriotic War, another invisible battle was unfolding. It was a secret war of intelligence, where any mistake could cost thousands of lives and influence the outcome of entire operations. The enemy sent professional saboteurs and spies into the Soviet rear in large numbers, whose task was to sow chaos and paralyze the army from within. To combat this threat, a new and extremely effective structure was created in the spring of 1943, the main Counterintelligence Directorate, which was given the formidable and concise name SMERSH, Death to Spies. This is the story of how this secret organization worked and who led the relentless hunt for the invisible enemy behind the lines and on the front lines. By the middle of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet Union found itself not only at the epicenter of the bloodiest battle in human history, but also at the center of a gigantic invisible war, a war of intelligence. The victory in the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended in February 1943, marked a turning point. The Red Army finally seized the strategic initiative. However, the German command, unwilling to accept defeat, resorted to total espionage and sabotage. Thousands of agents trained in specialized Abwehr and SD schools were sent behind enemy lines. Their objectives were varied: gathering information on troop movements, sabotaging railways, spreading panic among the population, and physically eliminating command personnel. German intelligence worked like a well-oiled, ruthless machine, and countering it required an equally effective system. Until the spring of 1943, the main burden of fighting enemy agents fell on the shoulders of the special departments of the NKVD of the USSR. The NKVD officers worked in the troops, fighting espionage, desertion, and treason. They had accumulated vast experience, but the very structure of their work was designed for defense. Now, as the Red Army was preparing for large-scale offensive operations, a new approach was needed. Counterintelligence had to work ahead of the game, act more aggressively, not just catch spies in their rear, but penetrate the very heart of enemy special services, disrupting their plans at the planning stage. It became clear that the existing system was unable to cope with the avalanche of threats. The enemy's network of agents had penetrated headquarters, military factories, and trains heading to the front. Every spy who slipped through could cost thousands of soldiers' lives. For example, a leak about a big offensive could mess it up and lead to huge losses. Saboteurs blew up bridges and ammo dumps, cutting off supplies to whole fronts. In the front-line zone, gangs of deserters and criminals became active, terrorizing the local population and diverting significant forces. The High Command and Stalin himself understood that for a successful offensive in the West, it was first necessary to secure their own rear, purging it of enemy agents and traitors. A reorganization was needed to centralize all military counterintelligence, make it more mobile and independent, and place it directly under the country's top leadership. The problem was exacerbated by the huge number of Soviet citizens who found themselves in occupied territories or in captivity. Among the millions of people who had survived the horrors of occupation and camps, the Nazi secret services actively recruited agents using blackmail, threats, and false promises. Distinguishing a true patriot from a recruited spy was an incredibly difficult task that required the highest level of professionalism and special techniques. Thus, by the spring of 1943, there was an urgent need to create a fundamentally new special service. Powerful, centralized, and ruthless, capable not only of defending itself, but also of striking preemptive blows against an invisible enemy. This was the dawn of an organization whose very name would strike fear into the hearts of spies and saboteurs. On April 19, 1943, in the midst of preparations for the decisive summer battles, the State Defense Committee of the USSR adopted Secret Resolution number 415-138-8. This document marked the beginning of the history of one of the most famous and effective special services of World War II. The main Counterintelligence Directorate, SMERSH, of the People's Commissariat of Defense was created on the basis of the special departments of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. The name of the new structure was not just an abbreviation, but a battle cry, a formula that encapsulated its entire essence. According to eyewitness accounts, the original name proposed was SMERSH, which stood for Death to German Spies. However, Joseph Stalin, who personally oversaw the creation of the organization, objected. He noted that the Soviet state was opposed not only by the intelligence services of Nazi Germany, but also by other countries, including allies. Therefore, the name should be broader and more universal. Thus, a short, sharp, and ominous word was born, SMERSH, formed from two words, Death to Spies. This name was a powerful psychological weapon in itself, leaving the enemy with no hope of leniency. The main feature of the new structure was its unique status. The SMERSH Counterintelligence Headquarters was removed from the jurisdiction of the NKVD and reported directly to the People's Commissar of Defense, who at that time was Stalin himself. This decision was of enormous strategic importance. First, it raised the status of military counterintelligence to unprecedented heights. Second, it ensured maximum speed in decision-making and response to threats, bypassing any bureaucratic obstacles. The head of SMERSH could report directly to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Viktor Semenovich Abakumov, a second-rank State Security Commissioner, was appointed head of the SMERSH GUCR. He was young, only 34 at the time, but already a very experienced and tough Chekist. Abakumov had a phenomenal memory, incredible stamina, and an iron will. He personally delved into many operations, knew hundreds of his employees by name, and enjoyed unquestionable authority. It was he who built a clear and effective system for the new special service. The tasks assigned to SMERSH were extremely clear: to combat espionage, sabotage, terrorism, and other subversive activities of foreign intelligence services in the units and institutions of the Red Army. In addition, SMERSH agents had to fight treason and betrayal of the motherland, desertion, and self-mutilation on the front lines. They were also tasked with checking military personnel who had been captured or surrounded. In effect, SMERSH became the Army's main shield, protecting it from any attacks, both external and internal. The creation of SMERSH was a timely and absolutely necessary step, a response to the challenges of a war that was becoming increasingly sophisticated and brutal, not only on the battlefields, but also in the secret confrontation between the special services. When we say SMERSH, we most often imagine a single monolithic organization. However, this is not entirely accurate. In fact, this formidable name concealed three independent counterintelligence structures created on the same day, April 19, 1943. It was a unique and very well thought-out decision that allowed for maximum coverage of all areas of the armed forces and ensured narrow specialization in the fight against the enemy. The main and most numerous structure was the main Counterintelligence Directorate of SMERSH, of the People's Commissariat of Defense. headed by Viktor Abakumov. It was, so to speak, the Army SMERSH. Its employees, commonly referred to as SMERSH officers, operated in all units and formations of the Red Army, from rifle platoons to front headquarters. Each division and each corps had its own special SMERSH department, which was subordinate only to its own vertical chain of command. The head of the SMERSH of the Army, who in turn reported to the head of the SMERSH of the front. This strict centralization and independence from the military command in operational matters was a key factor in its success. The division commander could not order an osobist to stop investigating a particular officer, which ruled out any pressure. The second structure was the SMERSH Counterintelligence Directorate of the People's Commissariat of the Navy. It was headed by Lieutenant General of the Coastal Service, Pyotr Andreevich Gladkov. This SMERSH was subordinate to the People's Commissar of the Navy, Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov. The area of responsibility of the naval counterintelligence officers was huge. All fleets and flotillas, naval bases, ports, and coastal units. Their tasks were similar to those of the Army, but had their own specific features. They fought maritime espionage, prevented sabotage on ships and in port facilities, ensured the safety of naval convoys, and conducted counterintelligence work in the Marine Corps and naval aviation. The enemy actively used sea routes to drop agents, so the work of the naval SMERSH agents was no less intense and dangerous. Finally, the third, and perhaps the most quiet and little-known structure, was the SMERSH Counterintelligence Department of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs of the USSR. Its head was State Security Commissar Semyon Yuhimovich. This department reported directly to the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, Lavrentiy Beria. It was responsible for counterintelligence work in the border and internal troops of the NKVD, the militia, and other armed formations of the People's Commissariat. They were responsible for security in the deep rear, at particularly important industrial facilities guarded by NKVD troops, and fought against banditry. Thus, a comprehensive counterintelligence defense system was built. The Army SMERSH covered the active army, the Navy covered the naval forces, and the NKVD SMERSH covered the deep rear and internal communications. Despite being three different organizations with different chains of command, they worked closely together, exchanged information, and conducted joint operations. This three-headed structure proved to be incredibly flexible and effective, leaving no blind spots where enemy agents could hide. Every spy who crossed the front line fell under the responsibility of one of these three services, and the hunt for him began immediately. To fully appreciate the scale and complexity of SMERSH's work, it is necessary to understand the enemy it faced. By 1943, German military intelligence and counterintelligence, known as the Abwehr, was one of the most powerful and extensive special services in the world. It was headed by Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Parallel to the Abwehr was the Security Service, SD, which was part of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA. Although these two organizations competed with each other, they created a huge network of intelligence and sabotage schools in the occupied territories of the USSR and in Germany itself. According to various estimates, by the middle of the war, there were up to 200 such spy factories in operation. These schools were not primitive courses. They were serious educational institutions with a well-thought-out training program. Cadets, who were mainly recruited from among prisoners of war, traitors, and ideological opponents of the Soviet regime were trained in a wide variety of disciplines. They were taught methods of gathering and transmitting intelligence, encryption, and how to use portable radio stations. Great attention was paid to sabotage training. Cadets were taught how to mine railway tracks, bridges, and industrial facilities, and how to handle explosives and poisons. A special course was devoted to the art of survival and camouflage in the Soviet rear. Future agents were provided with high-quality fake documents, Soviet military uniforms, money, and weapons. Each agent was given a convincing legend, a fictional biography that they had to know by heart. For example, an agent might have documents identifying him as a wounded Red Army soldier who had fallen behind his unit, or as an employee of a rear echelon agency going on a business trip. Agents were sent into the Soviet rear by various means. Most often, they were parachuted from transport planes, usually at night. Agents also crossed the front line on foot, slipping through gaps in the defenses, or were sent in disguised as refugees. The German command placed enormous reliance on this army of spies and saboteurs. They were supposed to not only obtain valuable information about the plans of the Soviet command, but also disrupt the rear, disrupt communications, and sow chaos and fear. A single successfully planted and undiscovered saboteur could cause damage comparable to that of an entire military unit. It was against this well-oiled and well-funded machine that SMERSH operatives had to fight. They had to not only identify and neutralize agents who had already been planted, but also learn to predict their arrival, know their drop-off points, and understand their goals and objectives. It was a titanic task that required not only courage, but also the highest analytical skills. The SMERSH agents were opposed by an intelligent, cunning, and well-trained enemy who constantly changed tactics and methods of operation. Every mistake made by a counterintelligence officer could have tragic consequences on the front lines. Therefore, the hunt for spies was a round-the-clock endeavor with no breaks. It was a contest of wits, willpower, and professionalism, and the outcome of the entire war depended largely on its outcome. The summer of 1943, in the fields near Kursk, Orel, and Belgorod, the greatest tank battle in history was being prepared. The German command, planning Operation Citadel, hoped to take revenge for Stalingrad, defeat the Soviet troops on the Kursk salient, and regain the initiative in the war. The success of this plan depended directly on accurate intelligence about the location, strength, and plans of the Red Army. The Abwehr and SD threw all their best forces into the battle. Dozens of reconnaissance and sabotage groups were sent behind enemy lines with the task of exposing the Soviet defenses. For the newly created SMERSH, the Battle of Kursk was the first serious test, a real baptism by fire, and the counterintelligence officers passed this test with flying colors. Work was carried out in all directions. SMERSH operatives from the fronts and armies operating on the Kursk salient launched an unprecedented cleanup of the frontline zone. Together with NKVD troops guarding the rear, they combed through forests and abandoned villages, checking every farmstead. Tight cordons were set up on all roads, and everyone moving in the rear was subjected to thorough document checks. A few weeks before the German offensive began, SMERSH agents neutralized hundreds of Hitler's agents. Many of them were captured immediately after landing, before they even had time to begin their missions. An effective warning system was established. The local population was instructed to immediately report any suspicious persons, the appearance of strangers, found parachutes, or suspicious objects. The vigilance of ordinary Soviet people was of invaluable assistance to counterintelligence. But SMERSH did not only catch spies. Captured enemy radio operators became the main weapon in radio games. Operatives forced them to work under their control, transmitting carefully prepared disinformation to German intelligence centers. The enemy was fed false information about troop movements, weak points in the defense, and the construction of fake airfields and defensive lines. As a result, by the start of Operation Citadel, the German command had a distorted view of the real strength of the Soviet troops concentrated on the Kursk bulge. They were unaware of the depth and strength of the Soviet defenses or the number of reserves ready to enter the battle. All of the Abwehr's intelligence work was effectively nullified. Thanks to the titanic efforts of SMERSH, the element of surprise was on the side of the Soviet command. When the German tank armadas went on the offensive on July 5th, they encountered a deeply echeloned, impregnable defense, about which their intelligence knew practically nothing. Sabotage activity in the rear of the Red Army during the battle was minimal. SMERSH proved its supreme effectiveness. It not only protected the troops from spies, but also actively participated in achieving victory by disorienting and blinding the enemy. The success at the Kursk bulge was largely due to the quiet and inconspicuous work of people in civilian and military uniforms, whose main weapons were their intelligence, composure, and devotion to their homeland. One of SMERSH's most sophisticated and effective methods of fighting German intelligence was radio games. This was the highest form of counterintelligence, requiring not only technical knowledge, but also deep psychological insight, an analytical mind, and incredible patience. The essence of a radio game was as follows. After capturing an enemy radio operator with a working radio and codes, SMERSH agents did not rush to arrest him. Instead, they would re-recruit him or use him blindly, forcing him to work under their complete control. From that moment on, the radio station of the captured agent, whom the Abwehr considered a reliable source, would begin broadcasting carefully prepared disinformation. These operations allowed several strategic tasks to be accomplished at once. First, they misled the enemy about the plans and intentions of the Soviet command. It was possible to report that an offensive was being prepared on one section of the front, while the main attack was being prepared elsewhere. Second, it was possible to identify new agent networks. In response to disinformation, German intelligence centers often instructed their agents to contact other spies operating in the same area, thereby bringing them out of the shadows and straight into the hands of SMERSH. Thirdly, it was possible to lure new groups of saboteurs and couriers. For example, a radio operator could request reinforcements, weapons, or explosives, and a counterintelligence ambush group would already be on its way to the drop-off point. Conducting a radio game was an incredibly difficult task. SMERSH operatives had to thoroughly study the personality of the captured radio operator, his character, habits, and, most importantly, his signature, his individual manner of working on the key. Any deviation could arouse suspicion among experienced Abwehr listeners. The best analysts and cryptographers were enlisted to compose the codes. The text of the dispatches had to be not only plausible, but also consistent with the level and capabilities of the agent. During the war, the SMERSH carried out 186 successful radio games. In the course of these operations, more than 400 German intelligence officers and agents were brought to Soviet territory and arrested. Dozens of tons of cargo were seized, including weapons, ammunition, food, and forged documents. One of the most famous radio games was codenamed Fog. In the summer of 1944, an Abwehr agent, a former Soviet officer named Tavrin, was captured in Belarus. He had been trained to carry out a terrorist attack against Stalin. SMERSH immediately began a radio game in his name. For several months, Tavrin, working under the dictation of SMERSH agents, bombarded the Abwehr with reports of his successful legalization in Moscow and preparations for the assassination. He requested additional weapons, money, and accomplices. As a result, SMERSH obtained valuable information about other German agents and the plans of German intelligence. Radio plays were a quiet, intellectual battlefield where victory was achieved not by force and pressure, but by cunning, calculation, and flawless execution. It was a real war on the airwaves, and SMERSH fought it masterfully, turning the enemy's main weapon into its own. If the radio plays were a skillful defense turned into an attack, then infiltrating their agents into enemy intelligence schools was a pure, daring, and incredibly risky offensive. It was one of the most secret and dangerous chapters in SMERSH's history. To get to the very heart of the enemy's intelligence system, to become one of them in order to obtain information from the source, such a task was only possible for a select few. For such operations, specially trained SMERSH officers or defected enemy agents who agreed to cooperate and whose loyalty was thoroughly checked were selected. Each future mole was given an impeccable cover story. Most often, these were stories of disappointment in the Soviet regime, of repressed relatives, of a desire for revenge. The agent had to not only learn his role, but also live it, become the person he was portraying. Then began the complex process of setting him up. The agent could be accidentally captured during combat or surrender himself after staging a whole performance. In a prisoner of war camp, he had to prove himself to be a fierce anti-Soviet in order to attract the attention of recruiters from the Abwehr or the SD. It was a game played on a knife's edge. Any mistake, wrong word, or even a glance could lead to failure and certain death. If the recruiters took the bait, the candidate was sent to one of the many intelligence schools. There, a new, even more dangerous stage began. The agent had to not only study hard, showing enthusiasm and ability, but also be under constant surveillance by the school's security service. They had to remember everything: the names and distinguishing features of instructors and cadets, training programs, encryption methods, types of radio stations, communication channels, and planned operations. This information was invaluable. When the training was coming to an end, the graduate was prepared for deployment to the Soviet rear. And this was the most crucial moment. After crossing the front line, the agent had to immediately report to the SMERSH authorities and hand over all the information he had gathered. The data obtained allowed counterintelligence to stay one step ahead. They knew dozens of future spies by sight, who could now be easily arrested upon their arrival. They knew what assignments they had received, where the weapons caches and meeting points were located. In fact, entire classes of some Abwehr intelligence schools were rendered ineffective before they even began their activities. Between April 1943 and February 1944, SMERSH agents managed to infiltrate 75 agents into the Abwehr and SD schools. Upon their return, they provided information on 359 career officers of the German Special Services and 978 saboteurs who had been trained for deployment. It was a huge success. The infiltration operations were the pinnacle of operational skill. They required not only nerves of steel and the highest level of professionalism from those carrying them out, but also a willingness to sacrifice themselves. These people voluntarily walked into the lion's den to tear out its fangs, and many of them did not return from this deadly battle. One of the most extensive, labor-intensive, and morally difficult tasks assigned to SMERSH was filtering. Millions of Soviet citizens had to pass through this great filter. Military personnel who had broken out of encirclement or escaped from captivity, as well as civilians liberated from German concentration camps or abducted for forced labor. On the one hand, these were victims of war, people who had endured unimaginable suffering and needed help and sympathy. On the other hand, it was precisely this environment that the Nazi secret services used as the perfect cover for the mass infiltration of their agents into the Soviet rear. Recruitment in prisoner-of-war camps was put on a large scale, using hunger, disease, torture, and threats of reprisals against their families. The Abwehr and SD persuaded thousands of Red Army prisoners and commanders to cooperate. Some were lured with promises of a better life. Others were simply broken mentally and physically. Recruited agents were instructed to report to the Soviet authorities after their release or escape, conceal the fact of their recruitment, and await further instructions. They were to settle in the rear, find work, preferably at military facilities or in transport, and, when given the signal, begin espionage or sabotage activities. It was incredibly difficult to identify such a sleeping agent among hundreds of thousands of exhausted but honest people. To solve this problem, SMERSH, together with the NKVD, created a whole network of collection and transit points, verification and filtration points, and camps. Every soldier who escaped from encirclement or captivity was sent for such a check. This was not an interrogation in the usual sense of the word. It was painstaking, multi-stage work. Several interviews were conducted with the person to clarify the details of their biography, the circumstances of their capture, and their stay in the camp. SMERSH operatives carefully compared statements, looking for inconsistencies and contradictions. At the same time, inquiries were sent to places of residence, places of service, and military registration offices. Colleagues and other prisoners who had been in the same camp were questioned. Particular attention was paid to those who were well fed in captivity, held positions in the camp administration, or were released under suspicious circumstances. SMERSH agents were skilled psychologists. They knew how to get a person to talk and distinguish a truthful, albeit confused, account from a tortured soldier from a spy's rehearsed story. In the course of this titanic work, thousands of agents of Hitler's special services, executioners, and Nazi collaborators who tried to infiltrate the rear under the guise of victims were identified and exposed. However, it is important to understand something else. The vast majority of those who passed the screening, more than 90%, were found innocent. After verification, they either returned to the front and continued to fight, were sent to work in industry, or were demobilized for health reasons. The screening process was a difficult but necessary element of the security system of a country at war. It prevented the creation of an extensive enemy spy network in the rear and saved the country from a wave of sabotage and subversion. It was dirty, thankless, but vital work, which SMERSH carried out with methodical precision. war is not just the front line. It is also a huge, seething cauldron in the rear, where the fates of millions of people are intertwined. And in this cauldron, in addition to spies and saboteurs, there was another serious threat: armed banditry and mass desertion. SMERSH, whose main task was to protect the army, could not remain aloof from this problem, as it directly affected the combat effectiveness of the troops and stability in the frontline zone. Desertion was a serious disease of any army at war. Soldiers who could not withstand the horrors of war, who were psychologically broken or simply cowards, threw down their weapons and left the front lines. They hid in forests and abandoned villages, trying to make their way home. Many of them formed armed gangs in order to survive. They were joined by escaped criminals released from camps at the beginning of the war and local looters. These gangs posed a serious threat. They looted food warehouses and shops, attacked convoys heading for the front, and killed local residents, administrative staff, and lone soldiers. Their actions not only terrorized the population, but also created an atmosphere of chaos and lawlessness in the rear, diverting significant forces that were so badly needed at the front. Combating this phenomenon was the responsibility of the NKVD's Department for Combating Banditry, but SMERSH took an active part in it, especially in the area of responsibility of military units. SMERSH operatives carried out intelligence work in these gangs, infiltrating them with their own people or recruiting one of the bandits. This allowed them to find out about the size, weapons, and plans of the group. Once they had accurate information, SMERSH operatives, together with NKVD troops or special army units, carried out Cheka military operations. The area where the gang was hiding was blocked off, after which a search began. The gang members were offered to surrender, and if they refused, an operation to eliminate them began. It was a real war in the rear, with shootouts, ambushes, and chases. In addition, SMERSH worked actively to prevent desertion. Osobists in the units monitored the morale of the fighters, identified panic mongers and instigators, and conducted interviews. They had to understand the mood in their unit, know about the problems of the soldiers, and report in a timely manner to the command about shortages of food or clothing, because it was often everyday problems that pushed people to extreme measures. This work was no less important than catching spies. A stable and secure rear was the key to success at the front. Every bandit eliminated and every deserter returned to the ranks was also a contribution to the overall victory. SMERSH served not only as counterintelligence, but also as a kind of military police, ensuring order and lawfulness in the immediate vicinity of the front line, where ordinary law enforcement agencies were no longer effective. By clearing the rear of criminal elements, SMERSH created conditions for the normal functioning of the army and saved the lives of thousands of civilians who found themselves in the combat zone. As the Red Army advanced westward and liberated occupied territories, SMERSH faced a new, extremely complex and fierce enemy. This was an armed nationalist underground, particularly active in Western Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland. Organizations such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian Forest Brothers, and the Polish Home Army fought their own war. Their goals were different, but they agreed on one thing. They fought against both the Nazis and the advancing Soviet authorities, striving to create their own independent national states. For SMERSH, this was a war of a special kind. Their enemies were not spies sent from abroad, but local residents who knew the area well, had broad support among part of the population, and had an extensive underground network. The UPA fighters, or Forest Brothers, were fanatical, ideologically motivated, and experienced fighters who had been trained in guerrilla warfare. They attacked small garrisons, killed Soviet activists, party workers, teachers, and doctors, and disrupted mobilization into the Red Army and food supplies. Their hit-and-run tactics were extremely effective in the wooded and swampy terrain. The fight against this underground became one of the main tasks of SMERSH and the NKVD troops in the liberated territories. Here, the methods were similar to those used against the gangs. Agent work played a key role. SMERSH operatives recruited agents from among the local population, and even from the underground itself. Militants who were captured, disillusioned with the ideas of nationalism or wishing to save their lives, became valuable sources of information. Based on their data, special agent combat groups were created. These groups consisted of SMERSH officers and re-recruited militants. They dressed in UPA or Forest Brothers uniforms, used their passwords and tactics, and infiltrated deep into enemy territory under the guise of their own. Operating undercover, they identified hideouts, underground bunkers, bases, communication nodes, and command centers of the underground. Once they had accurate information, they either eliminated the leaders themselves or directed large military units to their targets. It was a brutal and bloody struggle with no front lines, where an attack could come at any moment. The operations required not only courage, but also a deep understanding of the local specifics, language, and customs. SMERSH actively used propaganda, calling on ordinary members of gang formations to lay down their arms in exchange for amnesty. For many who had been forcibly drawn into the underground, this was the only chance to return to a peaceful life. This war after the war continued after the defeat of Nazi Germany until the early 1950s. For SMERSH and the state security agencies that replaced it, it was a difficult and exhausting confrontation, the final act of the tragedy of World War II on the territory of the Soviet Union. At the end of November 1943, the first meeting in history between the leaders of the three leading powers of the anti-Hitler coalition, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill, was to take place in the Iranian capital, Tehran. The fate of the world was at stake. The opening of a second front in Europe, the post-war order, and the coordination of strikes against Nazi Germany. Hitler and his entourage understood perfectly well that the physical elimination of the Big Three could radically change the course of the war, sow chaos in the Allied camp, and give the Reich a chance of salvation. On Hitler's personal orders, the German secret services began developing a top-secret operation codenamed the Long Jump. The plan was daring and risky. In Tehran, where a large German spy network had been established before the war, a group of professional saboteurs led by the legendary Otto Skorzeny, the Führer's favorite saboteur, was to be sent. Their task was to infiltrate the area where the embassies were located and destroy the leaders of the Allied powers. Soviet intelligence received the first information about the planned assassination attempt long before the conference began. The information came from various sources, including the legendary intelligence agent Nikolai Kuznetsov, who was operating in the Ukrainian city of Rivne under the guise of German Oberleutnant Paul Siebert. He managed to get one of the high-ranking SD officials to talk, and he let slip about the planned operation in Tehran. All this information was immediately passed on to the leadership of SMERSH and other special services. Ensuring the safety of the Soviet delegation and thwarting Hitler's plan became the #1 priority. An advance group of NKVD and SMERSH officers, led by experienced intelligence officer Gevorg Vartanyan, flew to Tehran in advance. Their task was to clean up the city of Nazi agents. A titanic effort began. Soviet counterintelligence officers, working with their British colleagues from MI6, began to identify and arrest German spies one by one. Surveillance was established on all suspicious objects and individuals. Particular attention was paid to radio communications. Radio intercept specialists scanned all frequencies around the clock. Soon, their work bore fruit. They located and decrypted several messages exchanged between local agents and Berlin. This made it possible to track down the main residency and arrest more than 400 German agents in Iran. The operation culminated in the interception and arrest of an advance group of German radio operators who had been parachuted near the city of Qom. They were supposed to establish contact with Skorzeni's main group of saboteurs. Having lost contact and realizing that their network in Tehran had been destroyed and that unprecedented security measures had been taken, the German command was forced to abandon the long jump. The operation failed before it even began. Although the main work in Tehran was carried out by NKGB foreign intelligence officers, SMERSH played a key role in gathering and analyzing primary information from the front lines and from agents embedded in German structures. It was SMERSH's timely reports on enemy plans that made it possible to prepare and strike first. The foiling of the assassination attempt on the Big Three was one of the most brilliant victories of the Soviet Special Services, demonstrating their high professionalism and ability to work closely with each other. The success of SMERSH would have been impossible without a whole arsenal of unique methods and operational technologies that were honed in the course of daily, life-threatening work. It was not just a struggle of strength and will, but also a competition of intellect, cunning, and technical capabilities. The foundation of all SMERSH activities was agent work. No technology could replace the extensive network of secret agents, or SECSOTs. They were recruited from all walks of life and the army, from ordinary soldiers and officers to nurses, cooks, and signalmen. These people voluntarily and secretly reported to the Osobist about all suspicious events, conversations, and moods in their environment. It was from them that the main flow of primary information came, which made it possible to identify enemy agents, panic-mongers, and traitors. Recruitment was a subtle art based on psychology. Some were recruited on the basis of patriotism, others using compromising materials, and still others were offered certain privileges. The most important method was external surveillance, or the filer service. A person suspected of espionage was placed under round-the-clock surveillance. Operatives, taking turns and using disguises, tracked all their movements and contacts, and recorded meeting places and hiding places. This made it possible to uncover the entire chain and track down other members of the spy network. SMERSH actively used operational and technical means, which were quite advanced for the time. Their arsenal included portable cameras disguised as everyday items, such as cigarette cases or lighters. These allowed them to secretly photograph documents or suspects. Eavesdropping devices were also used, which were secretly installed in rooms where agents could meet. SMERSH's chemical laboratories developed invisible ink for secret correspondence, as well as special compounds called chemical traps. For example, a powder that glowed under ultraviolet light could be used to treat a wad of cash or documents intended for an agent. After contact, invisible traces remained on the suspect's hands and clothing, which served as irrefutable evidence. Mail screening played a special role. All correspondence in the active army and the front line was subject to mandatory inspection by military censors. They looked not only for open information constituting military secrets, but also for encrypted messages. An experienced censor could identify spy correspondence by barely noticeable signs, code phrases, punctuation marks, word order, and pass it on to SMERSH for further investigation. Finally, we cannot fail to mention the personal professionalism of the operatives themselves. They were trained in the art of interrogation, in the ability to break even the most hardened spy, using not brute force, but logic and psychological pressure. They were masters of disguise and transformation, capable of working in any guise, from frontline officer to village resident. This whole complex of measures, from a wide network of agents to the latest technical means and highly qualified personnel, constituted the very arsenal that made SMERSH virtually invincible in the secret war. The secret war waged by SMERSH was no less bloody than the battles on the front lines. Every day, operatives risked their lives in combat with an intelligent, cruel, and well-trained enemy. The price of victory in this war was measured not only by the number of spies neutralized, but also by the lives of the counterintelligence agents themselves. According to official data, during the 2 years of SMERSH's existence, from 1943 to 1945, more than 6,000 of its employees died in the line of duty. This figure speaks for itself. SMERSH agents died in shootouts while capturing saboteurs, in the elimination of gangs in the rear, and were blown up by mines during reconnaissance and search operations. They took part in battles on an equal footing with ordinary soldiers when the situation at the front became critical. There are numerous cases when members of special units led faltering units into battle, inspiring the fighters with their personal example. Danger lurked at every turn. An agent infiltrated into an enemy intelligence school could be exposed at any moment. An operative working undercover in a gang risked being betrayed by a traitor. Even working at headquarters was dangerous. Enemy agents sought to infiltrate it first and foremost. The exploits of the MGB agents rarely became public knowledge. The nature of their service required secrecy. Their names did not appear in Sovinformbureau reports, nor were articles dedicated to them in frontline newspapers. They were awarded secretly, and often posthumously. During the entire war, only 4 military counterintelligence officers were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, all posthumously. They were Lieutenant Petr Zhidkov, Senior Lieutenant Grigory Kravtsov, Lieutenant Mikhail Krygin, and Senior Lieutenant Vasily Chebotarev. All of them died performing outstanding feats in battle, showing exceptional courage and self-sacrifice. For example, Senior Lieutenant Grigory Kravtsov, and SMERSH operative of the 79th Guards Rifle Division, replaced his company commander, who had been killed in action during the Battle for Poland in January 1945. He was the first to cross the Warta River with his soldiers, capture a bridgehead, and hold it until the main forces arrived, repelling several enemy counterattacks. He died a brave death in this battle. Behind every spy neutralized, every sabotage operation foiled, every successful radio game, there was someone's sleepless night, enormous risk, and painstaking work. The Mershevtsi were not just individualists and controllers, as they are sometimes portrayed. They were combat officers, soldiers of the invisible front, who made an enormous, though not always visible, contribution to the overall victory. Their work saved hundreds of thousands of lives, ensured the success of many military operations, and brought closer the day when the red banner was raised over the Reichstag. The memory of their quiet feat is an integral part of the history of the Great Patriotic War. Spring 1945. The Red Army was fighting fierce battles on the outskirts of the Third Reich's capital. Along with the advancing troops of the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts, SMERSH task forces also entered Berlin. For counterintelligence, this was the final decisive chord in their 4-year secret war. The SMERSH agents had special tasks in the Berlin operation. First, they had to ensure the safety of headquarters and advancing units from sabotage and terrorist acts by the remnants of the German special services and fanatics from the Werwolf, the Nazi militia. In the chaos of street fighting, in a huge, unfamiliar city where every basement could hide an ambush, this work was particularly dangerous. Secondly, a real hunt for archives began. SMERSH was ordered to find and seize card indexes, lists of agents, and other documents belonging to the Reich's main intelligence and punitive agencies, the Reich Main Security Police, RSHA, the Gestapo, and the Abwehr. These documents were invaluable. They made it possible not only to identify all German agents who had been sent to the USSR and were operating in Europe, but also to expose war criminals who were trying to hide under false names. SMERSH task forces, often risking their lives under fire, broke into buildings where, according to intelligence reports, the archives could be located. They descended into flooded basements, cleared rubble, and worked in burning buildings. As a result of these searches, part of the RSHA archives were seized, including the personal files of employees and lists of agents. Documents were found with detailed reports on the activities of sabotage schools, which made it possible to expose many of their graduates in the post-war years. The third most important task was to search for and arrest the leaders of Nazi Germany and its special services. SMERSH agents participated in the search for Hitler, Goebbels, and Bormann, and searched the Führerbunker. They arrested Wehrmacht generals and high-ranking SS and Gestapo officials. Their work helped gather evidence for the future Nuremberg trials. SMERSH's activities in Berlin were not limited to offices and archives. Operatives took direct part in street fighting. They led assault groups that captured particularly important targets, such as government buildings, communications centers, and train stations. Together with Red Army soldiers, they hoisted red flags over the defeated strongholds of Nazism. It was SMERSH agents who brought the identified bodies of Goebbels and his wife, as well as body parts believed to belong to Hitler and Eva Braun, from the Reich Chancellery for forensic examination. The Berlin operation was a triumph for SMERSH. The counterintelligence agents honorably completed their mission, putting an end to the history of the Third Reich's special services. Not only did they defend their army until the last day of the war, but they also laid the foundation for future security by seizing documents and criminals who could have continued their subversive work after the victory. On May 4, 1946, almost a year after the Great Victory, the SMERSH Main Counterintelligence Directorate was disbanded. its functions were transferred back to the Ministry of State Security. The 3-year history of the most effective military counterintelligence service of World War II had come to an end. What is the legacy of SMERSH, and why is its activity still surrounded by so many myths? The main and indisputable legacy of SMERSH is its enormous contribution to victory. During the war, its employees neutralized over 30,000 agents of Hitler's intelligence service, more than 3,500 saboteurs, and about 6,000 terrorists. They carried out nearly 200 successful radio games and infiltrated dozens of their agents into enemy special services. Thanks to their work, not a single strategic plan of the Soviet command fell into enemy hands. SMERSH managed to paralyze the activities of German intelligence agencies, ensuring the security of the rear and the secrecy of preparations for key offensive operations such as the Kursk, Belarusian, and Yas-Kishinev operations. These are objective facts, confirmed by documents. However, like any special service, especially one operating in a totalitarian state and during a brutal war, SMERSH had another, darker side. It was not only a shield for the army, but also a sword that punished any dissent. SMERSH performed the functions of a secret police within the army. Each unit had its own operatives, who not only caught spies, but also kept files on unreliable soldiers and officers, recruited informants, and monitored morale. Undoubtedly, innocent people also fell victim to this system. In wartime, when the lives of thousands depended on quick decisions, mistakes were inevitable. Sometimes suspicion and denunciation were enough for arrest. This duality gave rise to many myths. In Soviet times, SMERSH was exclusively glorified, its employees portrayed as fearless and irreproachable knights. In the post-Soviet period, on the contrary, the pendulum swung in the other direction, and SMERSH came to be portrayed exclusively as a bloody punitive machine, a branch of the NKVD engaged solely in repression. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. SMERSH was a product of its time, a brutal war and a harsh regime. Its employees were a mixed bunch. Among them were true intellectual heroes, counterintelligence virtuosos, and soulless careerists willing to ruin anyone's life for a star on their epaulets. But one thing cannot be denied. As a military counterintelligence system, SMERSH proved to be incredibly effective. It won its secret war against one of the world's strongest intelligence services, the German Abwehr. Studying its history, without embellishment or denigration, is not only a tribute to the thousands of counterintelligence officers who died, but also an important lesson about what a state and its special services are capable of in a total war. It is a story of heroism and tragedy, of feats and crimes, which still holds many secrets.